Section 14. How to secure your commission customer or client, or no representation. That is the question. By now, you can probably see how every part of agency connects. You explain representation. You complete the read. You establish the buyer relationship with the BBEEA. You confirm who you represent in the contract. You obtain limited dual consent when needed. Now comes the question every working real estate professional eventually asks. How do I make sure I get paid? That may sound like a simple business question, but it is really an agency question, a contract question, and a communication question, all wrapped together. The first thing every Arizona licensee should understand is this. You are not guaranteed compensation simply because you worked hard. You may have spent weekends showing property, written multiple offers, answered hundreds of text messages, and guided a buyer through the entire process. But if you do not have the proper written agreement in place, collecting compensation can become difficult. Hard work matters, but written agreements protect you. The purchase contract is not your commission agreement. One common mistake is assuming that placing compensation language in the purchase contract is enough to secure your commission. That is risky. The purchase contract is primarily an agreement between the buyer and seller. The brokers may be identified in the contract, and compensation-related addenda may be incorporated when appropriate. But the safest way to secure your right to compensation is through a separate written agreement with the party responsible for paying it. That may be a listing agreement, a buyer-broker exclusive employment agreement, or a seller compensation addendum. An unrepresented seller compensation agreement, or another broker-approved compensation agreement. If you enter escrow relying only on language inside the purchase contract, you may be placing yourself in a weak position if the party expected to pay later refuses, renegotiates, cancels, or modifies the transaction. The lesson is simple. Do not rely on assumptions. Get the compensation agreement in writing. The new compensation conversation. Years ago, many buyer's agents simply looked in the MLS to see what compensation was being offered. That world has changed. Today, buyer-broker compensation must be discussed and negotiated more directly. The MLS no longer functions the way many agents were used to when it comes to advertising buyer-broker compensation. This is why the BBEEA has become so important. The buyer needs to understand that your compensation is negotiable, that the seller may or may not agree to pay it, and that the buyer may be responsible for some or all of the compensation depending on how the transaction is structured. This conversation should happen before showings begin, not after the buyer falls in love with a home, not when the offer is being written, not 3 days before closing, before. A professional buyer consultation should include an honest discussion about how buyer-agent compensation works in today's market. A real Arizona example. Imagine you are working with a buyer in Tucson. Your buyer wants to purchase a home in Sedona. You are not familiar with the listing broker, and compensation is not displayed in the MLS the way it used to be. Before showing the property, you should already have your BBEEA signed with your buyer. That agreement explains what your compensation will be if the buyer closes on a property. If the seller is willing to pay your compensation, great. That amount may be credited toward the buyer's obligation under the BBEEA. If the seller is unwilling to pay all of it, the buyer may need to pay the difference. If the seller is unwilling to pay any of it, your buyer needs to understand that possibility before moving forward. This is not a bad conversation. It is a professional conversation. Buyers deserve to know how the process works. Using the seller compensation addendum, when a buyer wants the seller to pay the buyer broker's compensation, the request should be handled properly with the appropriate written addendum. In Arizona practice, that usually means including the seller compensation addendum with the offer when the buyer is requesting that the seller pay compensation to the buyer's broker. The seller may accept it, the seller may reject it, the seller may counter it. Like every other term in the transaction, it is negotiable. The important point is that everyone understands what is being requested and that the agreement is documented in writing. Do not work for free by accident. Most agents are generous by nature. They want to help, they want to serve, they want to solve problems. That is wonderful, but generosity should not turn into working for free because you failed to explain compensation. There is a big difference between choosing to reduce your compensation as a business decision and accidentally losing your compensation because the paperwork was not handled correctly. A professional agent knows their value and explains that value clearly. You help buyers understand contracts. You negotiate price and terms. You manage deadlines. You coordinate inspections. You communicate with lenders, escrow officers, and other agents. You help identify red flags. You reduce risk. You keep the transaction moving. That service has value. When the file goes sideways, let's look at another situation. You meet buyers at one of your listings. That home is too small, but you offer to show them another property nearby. They like you. You like them. Over the next 7 weeks, you show them 20 homes and write one offer. Then another agent in your office lists the exact model they want. You rush them over. They love it, and you write the offer. Only when you submit the file does your broker notice the problem. You never completed the read. You never completed the BBEEA. You never discussed compensation. You also marked the contract as if you represented only the buyer, even though the listing is with your same brokerage. Now you have an agency problem, a compensation problem, and a file compliance problem. What should you do? Do not ignore it. Do not ask title to clean it up. Do not quietly backdate forms. Call your broker immediately and ask how the broker wants the file corrected. Trying to hide them usually creates a much bigger problem than the original mistake. Your broker is responsible for supervision and file compliance. Let the broker guide the solution. What went wrong? In that scenario, the mistake started early. The agency conversation should have happened when the buyers began asking for your services beyond the original listing. The read should have been completed before the relationship developed further. The BBEEA should have been signed before showing additional properties. Compensation should have been explained before the buyer relied on your services. And when the buyer wanted to purchase a listing within your own brokerage, the limited dual representation issue should have been recognized before the contract was written. This is why systems matter. A good system protects you from yourself on busy days. No representation is not the same as facilitating. Sometimes, agents use the word facilitator to describe helping both sides without representing either party. Be careful. In Arizona, a real estate licensee's authority to draft or complete real estate documents comes from Article 26 of the Arizona Constitution, which allows licensees to prepare instruments incident to a transaction when acting as a broker or salesperson for the parties, or as an agent for one of the parties. That means your role must be clear. You are not just floating through the transaction as a neutral helper with no responsibilities. You need to know who you represent, what authority you have, what documents apply, and how compensation will be handled. No representation must be clearly understood and documented. Agency must be clearly understood and documented. Compensation must be clearly understood and documented. That is the pattern. Protecting your commission starts with protecting the consumer. The best way to secure your commission is not to pressure the client. It is to educate the client. Explain representation. Explain compensation. Explain the BBEEA. Explain seller compensation. Explain what happens if the seller does not agree to pay. Explain that the buyer should speak with their lender about what costs may or may not be allowed in the transaction. When buyers understand the process, they can make better decisions. And when everything is documented correctly, you are in a much stronger position to be compensated for your professional work. Broker tip: never wait until the offer stage to explain compensation. The compensation conversation belongs in the buyer consultation before showings begin. If the buyer understands your value, your representation, and how compensation may be paid, the rest of the transaction becomes much smoother. Online discussion question: why is it risky to rely only on the purchase contract to secure broker compensation? The purchase contract is primarily between the buyer and seller. Broker compensation should be supported by a separate written agreement or appropriate compensation addendum, so the broker's right to payment is clearly documented. Question: why should buyer-agent compensation be discussed before showing homes? Answer: buyers need to understand how their agent may be paid, whether the seller may contribute, and whether the buyer may be responsible for any difference. Discussing this early prevents surprises later. Question: what should an agent do if they realize agency or compensation paperwork was missed? Answer: the agent should contact their broker immediately and follow the broker's instructions. The agent should not ignore the issue, shift responsibility to title, or backdate documents without broker direction.